going to cover a lot of ground because I'm going to try and not only get us back to the present, but take a little bit of a peek into the future. So, you're ready for something sort of fast and deep at the same time? This is your thing. The main story I want to try and get across in the next few minutes is the idea that everything we've been talking about, AR, VR, MR, XR, is not new. In fact, it's old. It's very old. And when people are sort of excited about this because of its newness, they're sort of missing the whole point. That this is actually an extension of something that we as humans have been doing just about as long as we've been human. And the reason we get excited is not because of its newness, but because it's triggering something very deep in us, basically in the lower brain rather than the upper brain, about humans and how they use space and interact with each other, but particularly how they tell stories. And so this is a story about storytelling. So, we heard some mention about the sort of alphabet. I have a sort of a fairly long lead-in that I often do. I'm going to skip through it today. But on language, language is very important here. And unfortunately, most people are not using language correctly. That is to say, in a way that other people can actually react to intelligently. So when you're looking at definitions of all these terms, don't look at marketing companies, don't look at commercial companies for what the definition of the word is. Use a dictionary, and if you need to, use a computer dictionary. Terms and particular ways we talk about this are extremely important. Now, what I like to do is sort of back up from all these other terms, which are really talking about individual technologies. They're not talking about the underlying concept. If you wrap them together, you actually can view these as being alternate reality technologies. There are various ways to get to the notion of creating an alternate reality. Now, alternate realities are something that humans are really good at and really like in all forms. And we know it through the whole history of media, that every time a better or a more immersive or more enveloping media comes out, we jump right on it because it's triggering these same underlying thoughts and ideas. A lot of this is wrapped up in a Milgram and Kishino diagram from 1994. And yes, we were talking about this a long time ago. Real world on one side, virtual on the other, and in the middle is where it gets interesting. Augmented reality and augmented virtuality. You don't normally hear them in this context. This is the idea of bringing real objects into the virtual world and virtual objects into the real world. They both have a very interesting sort of place in this panoply of realities. In the middle, it often gets called MR, but as I think a little digging will show you, MR is a marketing term and XR is also a marketing term. They aren't really addressing the language in a way that we really would like to. I'm not going to go through each one too much right now, but as I say, words matter when you're trying to communicate with other people what you're trying to do. Some basic ideas of immersion. Now, the notion of the cave, usually I give this talk in a cave. I have a very nice cave at Harvard. And literally we can sort of talk about the notion of what a cave is and what it was and how it's really central to a lot of all this. One of the key things that I'm interested in language is the difference between virtual reality and virtual unreality. Unfortunately, at the very beginning, these got swapped. And when people started writing about this, they were being driven by the notion of games and virtual reality, and they linked the two together. This is unfortunate, because games are not real. They're not representing the real world. So games ought to be virtual unreality. If I copy the real world through 360 photography, put you back in that space, I'm dealing with reality. That should be virtual reality. So, pretty simple, straightforward thing, but unfortunately, it got reversed very early on. Now, these two guys had a pretty interesting take on reality. Would love to have had a conversation between the two of them. Reality is merely an illusion, albeit a very persistent one. We agree this tabletop is here, but actually proving it's there is a lot more difficult than you would expect. And John Lennon's comment, which is reality leaves a lot to the imagination, is very similar in a lot of ways. So, this all begins by essentially going down the rabbit hole. This is one of the base places to think about beginning alternate realities is Lewis Carroll and Through the Looking Glass. So, one of the very basic ideas that I like to start with begins about 2,000 years ago as a discourse between Plato and Socrates about reality. What is reality? What's real and what's not? This has been a discussion which has literally been going on for thousands of years. It's not a new idea. So the allegory of the cave is that you have some prisoners. They've been put in a cave. They're tied up behind a wall. The only light in the cave is a fire. The fire is casting shadows on the wall. Those shadows on the wall become the reality for the prisoners after they've been there long enough. One of the prisoners escapes, goes out to the outside world, looks around and goes, well, if that was reality, what is this? And he decides that actually it's been reversed, that what he's seeing now is reality. He's recaptured, he's brought in, put back in chains, and now he tries to convince his other prisoners that what they're seeing is not real, that the real world is elsewhere, and that they're experiencing unreality. This begins a very interesting discourse about what is real and what is not. So, this notion of how we begin this sort of dialogue is very early on, and it does happen at the beginning of the last ice age, sometime around 40,000 years ago. We start to emerge as the kind of thinking humans that we are now. At the time, we were probably, in many cases, depending on where you were in the world, living in caves. And so you begin to get this sort of notion of the cave as both a dwelling, but a meeting place, and most importantly, a place to tell stories. Now, we find these handprints beginning to appear sometime around 39,000 years ago, around the world in various places. Now, what is a handprint? Basically, you make a pigment by taking some ground up dirt, putting it in water, mixing it up, putting it in your mouth, and using your mouth like an airbrush. So you take your hand away, and what's left is a representation of your hand. So imagine the first guy who did this, right? Here's my real hand. I've now made a copy of my real hand. If this is my hand, what is that? This begins that notion of the other. The notion that there can be something other than what is real. A secondary notion of reality. Sort of begins as we start making these. And what happens is these appear all over the world at about the same time. You have them in Indonesia, you have them in North Africa, you have them in Asia in various locations. And they are very similar notions of, not only you could think of them as I am here, but basically I am here and I am there, which is an interesting notion. So, a few thousand years later, as the sort of Neolithic is advancing, particularly in southern France and northern Spain, we get some really amazing explosion of visualization, particularly in the caves in southern France and in northern Spain. I like to focus primarily on Lascaux, but there are many of these examples. Now, what's interesting about the caves at Lascaux is that they are probably, in my opinion, the first example of full-blown, immersive, multimedia environments. And they are basically running on the same set of premises that we're doing today when we establish what is a good or an effective or an immersive environment for storytelling or for exploration of different things. So here they're painting on the walls, but the walls are dimensional. So if you're painting a bison has 3 dimensions to it, but you've got roughly a 2-dimensional surface. So they look at boulders and protrusions on the wall, they find something that sticks out, and basically that becomes the shoulder of the drawing or the illustration. So they're beginning to think about 2.5D, as it were in graphics terms, a way to dimensionalize these drawings. Now, the cave itself is a processional experience. You start in the light, you start in reality, you head down into the darkness in search of another reality, another place which is not the world you live in. So these are processional stories. The stories unfold the deeper you go into the cave, and they surround you on all sides and on the top, and often in the bottom, actually. So, also you need a way to see, and so you have a combination of small lamps that are placed in crucial places along the path in the cave, and you're carrying torches. Now, this becomes really important when you start seeing illustrations like this. Many years ago, people looked at these and they thought, it's an artist trying to figure out how to draw a lion. Or it's an artist trying to figure out how to draw the head of a horse. We now know that this is not the case, because what happens is when you see these under flickering light, they move, they animate. So this is the prehistory of animation. So not only are your figures 2.5D surrounding you, but they're actually moving as a result of the kind of light field that you're generating in the space. So this becomes a sort of much more complex environment. Also, they would have had sound. Sound was very important. Caves echo. Caves produce interesting sounds. So you'd have vocalizations, you'd have people singing, chanting. You probably had various types of actual musical instruments that were at play. And This was adding to this ambiance. The burning torches were producing smells. You also probably mixed in incense. So you were beginning to trigger all your senses. You're creating this really immersive, very powerful environment. And this was something which we can't yet prove, but we're pretty sure was probably enhanced by various psychedelic or psychotropic drugs, which was basically enhancing this experience of leaving this world and going into another world. So they're creating a very immersive, very active story that is leading you down as deep as you can go by usually people who are what we would think of now as shaman or priests or leaders, who are basically unfolding this story for you as you get deeper and deeper into the cave. So, the Cave of Lascaux only was opened after its discovery for a number of years before it started to deteriorate from the presence of humans in the cave as visitors. So they closed it, they went nearby, they carved a new copy of the cave out of the real rock, they repainted it, restructured it so it looked identical to the original. This ran for many years until it also started to deteriorate. So now they got a problem. They've got a virtual copy of a real cave and their virtual copy is deteriorating. So they decided to go one step further and make a virtual version of the copy of the real cave, which they did. And this involves both a physical reality as well as a virtual reality. This is the president of France over here trying to figure out this virtual of real, that someone had just explained to him. A lot of this story is told by Werner Herzog in a very really excellent film called Cave of Forgotten Dreams. He was one of the few only filmmakers ever allowed in here. And not only did he record and document this, he did it in 3D. So this is really one of the great 3D films because it allows you to re-walk this original processional experience from about 20 to 30,000 years ago. Highly recommend it. So these paintings occur around the world. They gradually get more and more sophisticated. And as we move into about 10,000 years ago, we start getting settlement, we started getting the development of towns and cities and the growth of the city-state. We start getting civilizations that are beginning to use their resources to also do similar types of storytelling about alternate realities. Now, in this term, you're often talking about religion, and that alternate reality is the world that happens when you die. And there you get into a various discussion about which is real. Are we in the real now, or are we in the real later? Which of these is the more real experience? So you go through Egyptian, you go through Chinese. This is the great terracotta army, which was a great self-portrait that the emperor created to take with him. We go into the Greeks and the Romans. Here, this is the Parthenon in the center. It's not white, it's not pristine, it's not clean. It actually is meant to look like reality. The Romans particularly were excited about this stuff. They created virtual spaces in their homes. If they didn't like the view out the real window, they'd create a virtual window right next to it. Or they would have the two complement each other. So this idea we even see today. We are very happy about extending our own walls and creating these kind of realities. As we go into the medieval period, this gets even more interesting because for the first time, we create a physical device which allows us to produce an alternate reality. Guess what this is? It's the book. But more importantly, it's the book plus glasses. Because you couldn't read. You didn't have enough light.